They say that the land remembers. Before barbed wire and county lines, before Texas was anything more than a brash idea, half wilderness, half gamble, there was the dirt. In the northeastern corner of this stubborn state, the dirt is mostly black, not just dark, not just fertile, it's black gumbo clay. Thick as sorrow and just as sticky. When it rains, it turns into a kind of boot-sucking tar that smells like turned earth and second chances. When the summer heat sets in, it cracks open like a dry mouth, waiting on rain or mercy. It stains your knees, your memories, your inheritance. It remembers everyone who's ever tried to tame it. That's where this story begins, not in a courthouse or a fancy Bible, not in a photograph yellowed and curling at the corners. It begins here, in the soil, in the dirt. This is the land my ancestors walked, prayed over, bled on, and sometimes abandoned. It's where they buried their children and broke their backs. It's where they got up again and started over. This episode isn't about Charlie Henderson, though his shadow will stretch across every mile we walk today. Today, we take one step back in time to the man who raised the man who disappeared, my great-great-grandfather, Robert Alonzo Henderson. R.A. is what he chose to be called. You see, his name was Robert. His father's name was Robert. And his father's name was Robert. It's a genealogist's worst nightmare. So I'm pretty sure he chose to be called R.A. He left no letters, no journals, none that I found, just 12 children. And the sense that he was always half a mile ahead of his own story. He was born in Alabama in 1848, back when Texas was still stretching its bones as a new state. 4 years later, he was in a wagon, bumping along the hot breath of the frontier. His father, the Reverend Robert Pickens Henderson, led a wagon train of 5 families west into the unknown. Not just a preacher, but a patriarch in the making, trying to get ahead of war or debt or the ghosts behind them. That wagon train crossed rivers that had no bridges. They carved tracks into hills no one had named. They followed rumors of black dirt and soft winters until they came to the land just east of Bonham. That black gumbo clay, angry and generous, was the promise. But promises have to be built. Before there was a home, there was timber. R.A., just a boy, would have watched his father and the other men fell trees by hand. The air would have been thick with cedar dust, sweat, and the thudding rhythm of axes. The forests didn't part easily. They had to be cleared inch by inch. Trees became beams, beams became walls. Walls became rooms for people who knew they might never leave this land alive. There's something about being the son of a preacher on the frontier. You learn 2 kinds of labor, tilling the land and tending the soul. Reverend Henderson held both callings like reins in a single hand. One day he was baptizing new converts in a creek so cold it rattled your bones. The next, well, he was digging post holes in the heat thick enough to kill a man. R.A. would have learned young how to sit still on a hard bench and listen for the voice of God, even though it came through a hoarse throat with blistered hands. He grew up with the smell of kerosene lanterns and hymnals damp with Texas humidity. Church wasn't just a building. It was wherever his father stood, Bible in hand, voice rising like dust off a wagon trail. But it wasn't all sermons and seeds. Life was harder than that. Settling the land meant losing to it again and again. Crops failed. Cattle wandered. Children died. For the Reverend, the pulpit was carved with calluses. He prayed with the same hands he used to mend roofs and lift coffins. Faith on the frontier wasn't soft, it was survival. And in that crucible, R.A. was formed, a boy, not just raised by Scripture, but by weather, by soil, by death, by distance. When you stand in Shiloh Cemetery today, just east of Bonham, where the wind never quite stops, you can feel the weight of the time. The stones are worn smooth by weather and rain. The names are faint, but the dirt remembers. It remembers the preacher who tried to plant faith in fallow ground. It remembers the boy who watched, listened, and eventually walked away. Because if Reverend Henderson built the church, R.A. learned to slip out the back door. By the time that Charlie could toddle, the black clay of Fannin County was already letting go of R.A.'s boots. He'd done his duty to the land, or tried to, cleared brush, planted fields, tried to build a life, but something had shifted. Maybe it was economics. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the way grief remakes a man until even the soil feels foreign. In 1872, R.A. married Mary Leona Austin. She was a local girl born of settlers like himself. She was young, beautiful, and likely just as hopeful as he was. They built their life east of Bonham in the shadow of the same trees he had helped clear as a boy. A small home, a plot of cotton, and in 1873, their daughter was born. For a time, there was peace. Then came June 1875. We don't know what took his wife. Not childbirth. Their daughter was 2 by then. Maybe fever? Maybe one of those nameless infections that stole people from the world without fanfare. What we do know is that she was 21 and that she was buried in the dirt that remembers. Shiloh Cemetery. R.A. stood over her grave with a 2-year-old in one hand and a future already unraveling in the other. The black gumbo clay held his knees, his grief, his promise. He didn't linger. Grief was a place he couldn't afford to stay. Just east of Bonham, that cemetery tucked off a gravel bend in County Road 2730. You wouldn't find it unless you were looking for it. There's no grand archway, no iron gate creaking in the wind of Shiloh Cemetery, just a stand of trees holding their breath and stones that lean like tired men. But the land, the dirt, it knows, it remembers. Established in the 1860s, Shiloh is one of Fannin County's oldest resting grounds. It stretches over 4.7 acres, not grand, but wide enough to carry the weight of generations. Some graves are marked with limestone slabs worn smooth by the weather. Others, unmarked, are remembered only by family stories and patches of sunken grass. The earliest burials came just after Texas had barely settled into its statehood. By the time R.A. buried his first wife here in 1875, the cemetery had already started collecting names like a ledger, and the Hendersons, for better or worse, became part of that ledger. By 1877, R.A. had remarried. Lucinda Cynthia Frances McKeever, a name like a hymn with lots of words, a mouthful to say the least. And depending on what document you look at, depends on what her names are. Lou, Lucy, Cynthia, a woman with the backbone of one. She was strong, maybe a little older, maybe steadier. She brought light back into the house, structure to chaos, and in time, laughter. They had 11 children together. Not all of them lived. 3 years later, R.A. returned to Shiloh Cemetery with another loss, an infant son named William. Same plot, same dirt. Too many graves for such a young man who was still at the beginning of his life. Shiloh was never just a cemetery. It was a map of heartache. The Shiloh Cemetery Association has cared for it since 1952, but even before then, it was kept up by memory and necessity. In the bleached breath of winter, 1880, another son was born. Charles Newton Henderson. Charlie, the boy who would one day vanish, but for now was just a baby, wrapped in linen, breathing warmth into his mother's neck. Lucy's love would prove deeper than the graves. She endured childbirth 11 times and still kept her hands steady enough to braid hair, patch trousers, and ladle soup. She helped R.A. stand upright year after year as they outlived crops, calves, and children. But the land wasn't generous. The good plots were gone, and what remained was brittle with debt and doubt. For a man with too many mouths to feed and a heart heavy with names chiseled into stone, the only direction left was west. So he left, not recklessly, not in a rush. R.A.'s kind of motion was quieter, like a man who keeps walking after the funeral's over, unsure if he's heading home or away from it. Ellis County came first. Waxahachie, railroads, leatherwork. 13 years in the tax rolls. That's the only proof we have that he was there. A shed, perhaps, behind a small house, maybe filled with the smell of cured hides, leather, and lye soap. He worked with his hands, leather instead of plows. Maybe he needed a job that didn't tie him so hard to the soil. But even Waxahachie began to close in. Land prices rose, competition swelled, so R.A. did what R.A. always did. He cashed in, took his money, and left. He went to Jones County, a city named Anson. With dust and ambition, Charlie was 14, old enough to drive a mule team, old enough to feel rootless, and then again to Stonewall County by 1900. The census catches them in Aspermont. R.A., at 43, listed again as a farmer, trying to wrench a future from red clay and prayer. But the family is full and busting. Charlie, now 20, is still at home. But another Charlie Henderson appears, same age, same birthplace, already married, already replicating the myth. Two Charlies, one fading into the other. But the soil in Stonewall couldn't hold them either. It was thirsty with the promise of permanence that evaporated under its sun. Too many shallow wells, too much loss, and one more move, one more chance to start again, this time Dawson County, La Mesa, a town so new it still smelled like sawdust and wet paper. This time it felt different. You could smell La Mesa before you saw it. Cotton and kerosene, fresh lumber, sun-warmed tar and the sweat of men building furniture from blueprints and bootstraps. The wind carried grit, but also something lighter. Ambition, maybe? Or the faint, unfamiliar scent of stability. When R.A. Henderson arrived, the town wasn't much more than a promise printed on paper, a speculative frontier staked out in 1903. La Mesa hadn't even finished drawing its breath when he rolled in with Lucinda and what remained of their caravan of children. By 1910, by the time the census caught him there, and for the first time, Robert Alonzo Henderson wasn't listed as a farmer, not a tenant, not a laborer, a shoemaker. The census said own shop, his own account. It's a small line on a page, but it says everything. At 61, after a lifetime of moving dirt and burying children, R.A. had built something permanent, or at least something steady. A storefront, maybe just a single room with a low awning, tucked off Main Street, inside the smell of leather and leather oil, a workbench rubbed smooth by decades of hands, tools worn with familiarity, pegs of half-finished boots, soles waiting to be stitched, and a small bell on the door ringing like a pulse. Here he stayed. No more leases, no more crop lines, just leather, sweat, and the slow rhythm of repair. There's a kind of nobility in shoes. You don't notice them until they fall apart. They carry the whole weight of your life, and nobody thanks them for it. Maybe R.A. saw something of himself in that. Charlie was already gone, depending on who you ask. The census lists him elsewhere, living under a different roof. Some records suggest he had a wife by then, a second wife. Others say he vanished without a warning, but R.A. remained every morning, opening up his shop. Every night, wiping the dust from the workbench at the end of the day. In La Mesa, the Hendersons owned their home, a modest place not far from the shop. Likely wood-framed and dry as bone, it stood, where sidewalk met scrubland, with a small porch and maybe a lone tree bent eastward by the wind. Lucy's hands, weathered by decades of children and grief, kept the house running like clockwork. She brought in the laundry, stirred the stew, lit the lamps. The town grew around them. Rail lines lengthened, cotton gins clattered through dusk, schoolhouses filled up. R.A.'s shop became a fixture, a place where boys came to get their first boots and old men came to patch their last. A place where stories, traded over counters, outlived the men who told them, and still the land pressed its weight against the bones. But for once, it didn't chase him. He worked until his hands gave out, or until the town outgrew the pace of an old shoemaker. Either way, when the road called again, it wasn't with the urgency of the past. This time the move was north, but close. Slayton, just southeast of Lubbock. Maybe it was for the doctors, or to be near a son or daughter. The census finds them there in 1920 and again in 1930. R.A. is 80 now, listed without an occupation, a man in twilight, finally allowed to rest. By then, the shoemaker's shop in La Mesa had probably been sold or shuttered. Maybe the sign still hung. Henderson's Leather or something like that. Maybe the bell still rang now and then, even after the door stayed shut. But in 1937, R.A. died. No grand obituary, no photograph in the newspaper, just a simple paragraph, just a line, helped organize Dawson County. as if all those miles and all those graves could be summed up in a single civic contribution in a single paragraph in a local newspaper. They buried him back in La Mesa. Not Fannin County, not Shiloh Cemetery. La Mesa. The town he helped build. The place he finally stopped running. And maybe that's the truest kind of legacy. Not the kind etched into monuments, but the kind measured in souls mended, in towns made livable, in silence endured. The dust settled, the shop stayed closed, but the scent of leather, the echo of a hammer on a heel, that stayed. Texas in 1848 was not yet 12 years old. The ink on its annexation papers had barely dried. It had survived revolution, endured republichood, and now stood awkwardly in the Union, a gangly, unbroken land of scrub and potential. It wasn't so much a state as it was a proposition, rough, fevered, and always moving. Robert Alonzo Henderson was born that same year in Alabama, a state rooted in red clay and tradition, but he wasn't born to stay. His parents, the Reverend Robert Pickens Henderson and Mary, joined a wagon train of 5 families that left Alabama in 1852 and headed west. They didn't write essays. They didn't publish intentions. They just hitched their dreams to wooden wheels and drove straight into uncertainty. They were Baptist, most likely. That brand of Southern Protestantism that knew how to split rails and scripture with equal zeal. The journey from Alabama to Texas would have taken months. Rivers had to be forded. Rain came down sideways. Oxen probably died. Wagons likely tipped. You don't cross that kind of country without leaving pieces of yourself along the trail. By the time they reached Fannin County, R.A. was 4 years old, a boy just old enough to remember the sound of his mother crying under a canvas flap, just young enough to grow up thinking that all land had to be earned by loss. The 1860 census is quiet on the Hendersons, as if they momentarily slipped out of record and into myth. Then came war. The Civil War shattered what little permanence the settlers had built. Texas, though far from the eastern battlefields, sent men, horses, cotton, and dreams to the Confederacy. In 1864, it took R.A.'s oldest brother, Samuel, just 19, no known grave, just a name, a date, and silence. R.A. was just 16 when Samuel died, old enough to ride a horse, but not yet called to fight. Still, the war found everyone. Supplies ran thin, churches empty, grief moved in like a tenant. In all this chaos, R.A. became a man, and like many sons of the South, he did what he'd been raised to do. He rebuilt. But the land wasn't the same, nor was he. Texas, after the war, wasn't just wounded, it was ravenous. Land grants, cattle drives, railroads punching their way through Texas like veins. Every man with a shovel and a dream came west, and every man who'd lost something in the war, a brother, a farm, a future, came looking for what had been taken. R.A. wasn't a soldier, but he was a survivor. Texas is a land that doesn't abide stillness. It makes its heroes by burning them out. The preacher's son became a patriarch, not by inheritance, but by sheer endurance. From the red clay of Alabama to the red dust of La Mesa, he kept walking. You could chart R.A.'s life by the county lines and census records he left behind him, but you'd be missing the point. His life wasn't built in courthouses. It was built in cotton rows and widows' bedrooms, in the sound of a child's cough at midnight, in the creak of a wagon wheel 100 miles from home. He was part of the Texas that didn't make headlines, the kind that dug in, that folded its losses into calloused hands and prayed anyway. The kind of Texas that was built by men who never wrote a word of it down. Charlie inherited that motion, that unspoken magnetic pull to drift before the dust settles, the restlessness that roots itself not in geography but in the bloodstream. What he passed down wasn't money, it wasn't land, it was the grind, the long haul kind of dignity, the kind that sharpens a blade and patches a boot. He raised 12 children, buried 2, probably more, whose records were lost to time and fire. He built towns, tilled land, watched railroads split open fields he once walked a mile behind a mule. Charlie was different, but not. He was the son who would one day disappear, not buried, but lost in the records. A question mark in the family tree, but the vanishing act, that came from somewhere. It came from a father who learned to keep moving after funerals. A father who knew that grief doesn't always look like mourning. Sometimes it just looks like motion. Like paying taxes in one county and then packing up before the ink dries. We don't know if R.A. ever said goodbye to Waxahachie, to Anson, to Stonewall or Slayton, to Charlie. But we do know where he ended, La Mesa, buried in the same ground he once worked. No grand obituary, no monument, just a plot of dirt and silence thick as gumbo clay. That silence, it got passed down too. It's there in the records that don't quite match. In the census is where Charlie's name skips like a scratched phonograph. In family stories, half told in half truths and in shrugging guesses. In the photo albums with no labels. But silence doesn't mean absence, not really. Like the boots R.A. repaired, now long turned to dust, or the towns he helped found still stitched into Texas-like seams. Or the fact that he's still telling his story, not because we know everything, but because we know enough. We know he kept going. We know he didn't break. You know that even in silence, when handed down right, silence can shape a man. And the soil he worked, that dirt, the soil never forgets. You're listening to Finding Grandpa Charlie. I'm Irv Lindsay. Today we followed the man who came before the man who disappeared. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, please follow, leave a review. It really helps, and share with others who also enjoy true crime family mysteries. I'm Irv Lindsay. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.